Thank you so much for joining us today for Senate Education Committee meeting. Do we have any bill introductions? Seeing none, we will start with our presentation on the annual report of language assessment for the program of deaf and hard of hearing for fiscal year 2023. So I'll first call Angie Walker. Angie is the language assessment program coordinator and education consultant for deaf and hard of hearing for the Kansas School for the Deaf. Angie, thank you for being here today. It is not.
Now, the green means.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you very much for having me here. This is for the fiscal year 2022, and I am happy to have the opportunity to share this information with you. So the language assessment program provides a vital service that allows professionals who have the training and expertise and knowledge of working with children who are deaf and hard of hearing to collaborate and support families and service providers and school districts who work with those children who are deaf and hard of hearing. You may recall from previous presentations that we know early fluent communication is critical and essential to typical cognitive, social, and emotional development of any child. And we also know that children who are deaf and hard of hearing frequently do not have complete access to language, whether it be signed or spoken. And this can cause interruptions in the natural development of their language. So the purpose of LAP is to assess, monitor, and track the language development of deaf and hard of hearing children ages birth through 8 throughout the state, and that includes all children who are deaf and hard of hearing, regardless of whether or not they're receiving special ed services, regardless if they use sign language or spoken language, and regardless if they have amplification devices. And then the intent, of course, is for the data to let us know if the interventions that are being used are being successful and should be continued, or if alternative interventions should be considered. So from July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022, 132 deaf and hard of hearing children were assessed in LAP. 55 of those were birth to 3, 33 were 3 to 5, and 44 were 5 through 8. And we use a very specific assessment process. It includes one and sometimes more language samples, a variety of language development checklists, and or standardized language assessments. The assessments are provided in the child's home or the school environment, whichever is appropriate. And all assessments are administered and analyzed by LAP specialists who have been trained in the specific administration of those assessments. So using the results of the assessments, we complete what we call a language milestones document, and that will indicate whether or not a child is meeting their age-appropriate language milestones in ASL or English or both. And the results that I'm presenting today are based on that document. So again, 132 children were assessed, and 84% did not meet their language milestones. 62 children were assessed in ASL, and 87% did not meet their milestones. 104 children were assessed in English, and 86% did not meet their milestones. And if you do the math, that doesn't necessarily add up to 132 because some of them are assessed in both languages. And then 22 of the children had identified additional disabilities. And these reports, or excuse me, these results have been consistent since the beginning of this program. Now, the statute also requires us to report existing data from the state performance plan on pupils with disabilities, and we get this data directly from the Department of Ed. The portion of the plan that is most relevant to LAP is indicator 7B1, and that looks at the percent of preschool children ages 3 through 5 with IEPs who demonstrate improved acquisition and use of knowledge and skills. And those knowledge and skills include early language and communication and early literacy. So during 2021-2022 school year, which is the fiscal year 21 state performance plan, when looking at preschool children whose primary or secondary disability was not deaf or hard of hearing, results indicated 87.64% of preschool children demonstrated improvement in acquisition and knowledge of those skills. And when looking at children whose primary or secondary disability was deaf and hard of hearing, 82.61% demonstrated improvement. And so that does, showing improvement is always good, and that's a large number, and it almost looks contradictory to what our numbers show. However, there's several caveats that we have to consider when we're looking at that data. So first of all, the state data is only looking at ages 3 through 5 or until a child leaves preschool, whereas our data includes birth through 8. Their data looks only at kids who are on IEPs, so they're comparing children who have special needs with other children who have identified disabilities, where ours looks at the language development specifically as it compares to typically what we would expect language development to look like. And then finally, the state data looks at improved acquisition and use of any knowledge and skills. And that does include language and communication, but it's not limited to just language development, which is what the LAP looks at. So it's just important to remember that the data is not, we're not looking at the same population, and we're not looking at the exact same skills. And that is one example that draws attention to the need to use specific assessments to monitor language development for our deaf children, as well as the need for in-depth analysis and by professionals who have that training and expertise in working with deaf and hard of hearing children. We do have services and screenings in place, but they are not meeting the needs of this particular group of children, which of course led to this statute. So limited access to language, signed and/or spoken, is a primary factor causing the language delay of deaf and hard of hearing children. And that has a potential impact for those delays can be significant, and they can be long-reaching. They can have a negative effect on a child's social emotional well-being, their disposition, their cognitive ability, and indeed their ability to be a contributing taxpayer member of the society. So LAP supports families and local service providers by identifying the language needs of their deaf and hard of hearing children, as well as suggesting interventions that can be implemented to prevent the language delays from occurring in the first place. So I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to stand for questions.
Committee, what questions do we have? We'll start with Senator Petty.
Madam Chair, and thanks for the presentation. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand. So in the conclusion, were the same children tested in both categories when you have the state performance plan, when you have the 87.6% of preschool children ages 3 to 5 with IEPs, and then you and 82 of them demonstrated improved acquisition, and then you talk about the population of children with deaf and hearing, but are the population with children with deaf that have deaf and hearing issues, are they in that same population?
So thank you, Senator, for the question. If I understand correctly, so not all of our students who are 3 to 5 will have been represented in the state performance plan, because not all of our children are on IEPs. So this is only going to be children who are on IEPs, and what they have done is disaggregated the data to look at kids with any disability that's not deaf and hard of hearing, and any disability that is deaf and hard of hearing. And the way I understand it, again, this is not our data, but the way I understand it is that improvement is based on IEP goals. So they're very individual. So the standard might be against the student's own self to show improvement, whereas our tests are comparing to typical development because that's what we expect of our kids. We are deaf and hard of hearing children. If there's nothing else involved, they should have language skills that are up here, but they keep showing up down here because they don't have that access. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. I'm trying to, I mean, wouldn't the majority of the students have IEPs if they're in a school setting?
Probably the majority, yes. But the other thing to consider too is not all of the children who are in the state performance plan are necessarily in LAP either, because we aren't yet seeing all children throughout the state, right? So I mean, it's really, I don't think it would be fair to say that it's the same children necessarily without really in-depth analysis of who's being assessed.
Other questions, committee? Senator Gossage.
I appreciate Senator Petty's question because I too was confused. So trying to understand that what we're looking at is an annual report of the language assessment program. That's it.
Correct.
It's an assessment of the program, but we're not talking about a particular program, or are we?
Thank you, Senator. Not 100% sure I understand. So the program does these assessments, and then we're looking at how those children are performing on those assessments of the language.
And this is just a report about how those children performed on the assessment.
Correct.
That's what I needed. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
I like those easy questions then.
So talk to us a little bit about the charts, figure 4 and figure 5. So it indicates that 104 students will look at figure 5. 104 students were assessed in English, and only 14% met what would be age appropriate. So if these children were deaf or hard of hearing, but did not have like a cochlear implant or hearing aids, how would they be assessed in English?
Thank you for your question. So first of all, it's likely that many of them do have hearing devices. If they do not have hearing devices, they're assessed in the same way that they are expected to be receiving information in their daily life. So if they don't have any kind of device or ASL or something like that, they're going to be assessed, and that assessment then would reflect their lack of access to language.
Is it possible to go back to those 104 students, at least the information that was collected on them, to identify how many of them actually had some type of hearing device?
Thank you for the question. I am not sure. I cannot answer that with certainty. I'd be happy to go back and try. We collect that data, but our database is not necessarily friendly in getting some of that specific information yet, but I would be happy to try.
And is it correct to make the assumption on figure 4, the 62 students that were assessed in ASL, only 13% met what would be age appropriate level for American Sign Language? So again, does this represent all of the age groups or only those that would be school aged, the 3 to 9?
Both of those represent birth through 8.
Okay. So who would be providing any type of ASL training to parents?
Thank you for that question, and that's a fabulous question. And KSD definitely has some programs in place where we can support ASL acquisition or learning for parents. However, just because of funding and of capacity, that's limited. And I think you hit it right on the head that we're talking about access, and our children need access, and for that they need families who can sign ASL or do know how to use spoken English with a child who's deaf or hard of hearing. And I'd say that's a pretty big gap that we need to look at filling.
So when I look at that map, which you included, that indicates where these children came from. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And are we able to determine, based on that map and the counties that are represented, which of those have some type of ASL training available for parents?
Thank you for that question. And no, we do not. That is not data that we collect, like what the school or the county can provide. I don't know if the Department of Ed would have that, or the Part C program. It would be something that we could perhaps look at to get, but that is not information we collect for our program.
I guess the last question that I do have has to do with, again, ASL. So does the School for the Deaf or does any other entity, the Department of Education, any other entity provide signing for parents or caregivers on virtual?
Thank you. The Kansas School for the Deaf does. We do have provisions in place for local families who can come to the school and have that and get ASL instruction. And then outside of a particular radius, then we provide virtual sign language lessons. What we need to remember with that is, again, we have limited staff who can provide that. But our program, we have a waiting list for that program. It's very good, and I think it's very effective. We have also what's called a deaf mentor program, where deaf individuals are partnered up with the family, and I think that program is extremely effective. And we just have a limited number of people who can provide that service.
So help me understand, if it's delivered in a virtual manner, why would there be a waiting list?
Thank you for the question. It is set up for one-on-one with a family, so it's not a whole class. So the family can come and say, hey, we're talking about this. How do you do this? And so it's very individualized. So that's probably one answer. The other answer is, I mean, our instructors have their own part-time jobs, families have, they can only meet at certain times, and there's several different reasons probably.
Okay, that did make me think of one other thing. I know that there are some school districts that go into homes to train families sign language, not so much for kids that are deaf or hard of hearing, but for children that are nonverbal, and they might be on the spectrum, but are nonverbal, starting as young as the preschool age. So do we know how many school districts in our state offer those type of services? And would those sign language services for a nonverbal, a family with a nonverbal child, would those be the same as sign language training, ASL training, for a child that was deaf or hard of hearing? I just want to make sure that when we're talking about sign language, it's the same is it the same for both of those conditions?
So thank you very much for that question, and I do appreciate it, and likely there is a difference. I can't say for certain, we don't have that information, but what I know about those types of programs, we're typically looking at using signs to help with communication, but not language. American Sign Language is its own language with its own syntax, and so it's likely not going to be similar or definitely not sufficient for what our children need.
That's what I was suspecting. Senator Dietrich, thank you for those answers.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at your Kansas map, and the numbers of children in each county. I just thought it was interesting that Shawnee County is the second largest grouping of hard of hearing and deaf children. Is there a particular factor causing that? I mean, Johnson County would be your school for the deaf. Why has Shawnee County always been at that level?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And I don't have the answer. We don't necessarily have causal information in our program. So I don't have the answer.
Well, it's kind of interesting because, usually you look to Sedgwick County and Johnson County, the largest population centers. And to see Shawnee County have 11, I thought maybe there might be a factor there we need to be aware of.
I mean, so this is me stretching, not based on any data. It's possible that the people who work in those early intervention programs and who work in those schools know about the School for the Deaf, know about LAP, and we're able to include more of them. As it's set up now, we're entering children birth to 3, and then they're staying in the program. We were trying to go out and get those school-age children, and we don't have the staff to do that at this time, so we're just phasing them in. So if they happen to be receiving birth to 3 services from our early intervention program, I mean, that could very well be an explanation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm not saying any. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Committee, we do have with us Dr. Craig Nunswander, with Deputy Commissioner with Kansas Department of Education. So Craig, you're here to talk about some additional information that you were able to prepare for the committee. And I think you probably already sensed that we had a couple of questions that we would like some follow-up from our presentation just before you. Is it possible that you can identify for us the number of school districts within our state that do provide some type of early child intervention for the families as well as for the children that are deaf and hard of hearing? So we are looking at that age 3 and above. And then we also would like to have some clarification as to the signing, if they're providing that sign language in some manner. Is it ASL for a child that is deaf or hard of hearing? And is it ASL that's being taught on behalf of a child that might be nonverbal?
I will see what type of information we have on that.
Okay. I think that would be helpful. And that just kind of dovetails with the information that we received yesterday with regard to the ASL classes that are being taught at the high school level by folks that don't have particular credentials.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think I'll know what that means.
You can always follow up. Cindy has a recording, and she'll be able to track it down.
Keep me straight, I
Yes,
understand
she
that
will.
very well.
So welcome again to our committee.
Thank you. What you received from us was actually the first round of additional requests that you had. There is a second round that we're putting together now, and that second round dealt mostly with the special education questions. But the first round was more about enrollment and licensed and non-licensed personnel, kind of general overview information. And so you have a number, right, I hope you have a number of documents available. One is an explanation of the low and high enrollment weighting. There was a question about that. So there's a document that explains what it is and how it works and shows you the formula, but it's a lot easier to understand if you look at the last page of that document and you see the graph.
Senator O'Shea, did you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, is there a way, can you help us, are these documents titled? Low enrollment, okay.
If you look at topic, so you'll see him as a presenter, and it will show us topic. So it's on the bottom of page 1.
Good point, thank you.
And unfortunately, the system, just so everybody understands, when our assistant enters these into the system, it just loads them the way it wants to. It's not alphabetical, it's not in the order she loads it. It just has a mind of its own.
I will try to tell you the name of the document that should be showing up, hopefully on your screen, so you know which one I'm referring to. So the low enrollment factor, you may recall we talked about, is on a sliding scale. The smaller the district, the more additional weighting they receive per student in order to compensate for the fact that they don't have many students generating funding for their district. And so there's a picture or a graph on the bottom of that handout, the last page that's in it, that shows you what happens. And we didn't plot the literally thousands of points that could be, so it's not a real smooth line, but if you plotted all of them, you'd get a little more of a curve effect than that straight line that you see. And once you get over to about 1,626 or so, or 1,662, I may have turned those numbers around, from there on, every district receives the same amount of weighting per student for low and high enrollment weighting. But if smaller than that, again, the smaller you are, the higher the amount of weighting you get. So if you're looking at that, hopefully it's numbered or labeled clearly. The bottom scale is how many students are in your district, K through 12, and the scale on the left-hand side is what the weighting factor is. So if you're 100 students or below, the weighting factor is essentially 1.0. You receive an extra one point, and it's not quite 1.0, it's slightly more than that for each student.
Are there questions about the high and low enrollment? Senator Dietrich.
Thank you. So is it still, would you say that the average school district size in Kansas is still 500 or below?
The median is about 524.
And that hasn't changed much, has it?
No, it's been consistent 525 to 540 for several years in a row.
What is the size, if I might, of the smallest district in Kansas? What's their enrollment?
I wouldn't always know this off the top of my head, but we just went through this with another group. So believe it or not, K through 12 this year, we have one district with 38 students.
Oh, and that is where?
That is Healy. And the largest is almost 47,000. Wichita.
Thank you.
And there are some of us that have had a classroom of more than 30 students.
It's probably true. I know that's true. I'm there too.
Okay, other questions on this? Seeing none, let's move on to the next.
Okay, we talked about pre-K at-risk students and the weighting for them of being 0.5. And the question that was asked is, how about the at-risk criteria for pre-K? So you should have a document named that, pre-K at-risk criteria. Unlike K-12 at-risk or high-density at-risk, that is not tied solely to income. There are a number of factors that allow students to qualify for a preschool at-risk program. And you can see those factors listed there and a little explanation of each one of them. So things like poverty, single-parent families, DCF referral, and so forth on down the line. Any one of those factors would qualify a student for the preschool at-risk program. And those are somewhat similar, not word for word, but somewhat similar to the factors that also qualify for Head Start programming.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Craig. So looking at these different factors, does each criteria use the same factor of additional funding, or do different factors have different funding amounts, additional funding amounts?
Thank you. Good question. Every preschool at-risk student's weighted at 0.5, regardless of which factor put them in the program or allowed them to participate in the program.
Follow up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to talk this out so I understand it and everybody else does. So if a student is poor, if a student has teen parents or whatever the situation is, that student is basically in a school district that has the 16, just say the school district has exactly the 1622 number or 1621 number. That student's base aid funding is 1.0 plus the 0.5. So essentially, that student's funding is 1.5, not just 1.0. Is that correct?
Hesitating because I don't know that the low enrollment weighting is applied as a 1.0. It may be proportional to the FTE weighting of the students. If they're 0.5, they may get 0.5 of the low enrollment weighting. If you allow me just a second. Either one of you know that? We'll have to check that for you to be sure.
Okay, thank you.
Should know, I don't.
Senator Erickson and then Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if I may go back to the previous information you shared, Craig, I was just kind of curious that Healy, did you say has 38 students in the entire district?
Yes, ma'am.
Do they have a superintendent?
Part-time, yes.
Do they have a separate principal?
I'm not sure about that.
There's one listed on their website, so I was kind of curious as to why a district with 38 students would need 2 administrators. Just curious.
That would be a local board decision of how many personnel they need to have.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Is it possible that 0.5 superintendent is a 0.5 at a different district?
He is. And I don't know that it's 0.5 and 0.5, but he is part-time in 2 different districts.
Okay. Still begs the question. So I have Senator Petty, and then I have Senator Straub again.
Craig, back to the at-risk preschool, and I taught at-risk preschool
Okay.
for 10 years, but so on the school district would have to have the program.
Correct. Must have an approved program, and these criteria qualify the child to attend. They're not required to attend, and that's certainly voluntarily on the part of the family.
And can you tell us how many of our school districts currently have at-risk preschool programs? That doesn't necessarily mean they're accommodating the number of 4-year-olds, but.
Right. Not off the top of my head, but it's a number we can find really quick, yes.
Thank you.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just going back to Senator Erickson's question about the smallest school district, which is actually in my Senate district in Lane County. And just for a little bit of extra information and insight into the geography of education in Kansas, Lane County is one of the smallest counties in my 12-county district. My Senate district accounts for over 10% of the land area in Kansas. Also, amongst those 12 counties, I do not have a single private high school in my district. So just a little food for thought.
You have any more reflection on how many superintendents and principals we have there? Do you know?
I do not have the total numbers in my head, but I can look into that. Yeah, sorry.
Other questions? Seeing none, we are going to move away from the school district of 38 students. We are going to move away from this particular issue, and if you would, from pre-K, so will you take us to what it appears as your next slide?
Okay. So you have one hopefully labeled SF23-037 licensed personnel. Licensure. And I can't see the full name of it on my printout. So.
I see a non-licensed personnel check.
Okay, you should have a non-licensed personnel and a licensed personnel.
Okay,
They're,
we see it.
okay. And they're both the same concept. When we were here last time, we gave you a printout for each year for the last, and I don't remember now, 3 or 5 years. And the question was asked, well, what do the totals look like over that span? So that's what this printout is just comparing the first year in that range with the last year. So if you scroll down until you get to the printout portion, you can see in each of those categories how many personnel there were in 2018-19, and then how many there are in 2022-23, and what's the difference. So you can see total licensed personnel, how it's changed over the time, and then by each of those categories.
Committee, do you have questions about this information? Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just at first glance, we obviously increased in our administration, but we weren't necessarily increasing in students. I don't know that there were any new schools created. What's the reason?
I think every district would give you a different reason. Part of it may be, were they relatively low or relatively high in 2018-19 to start with? So are they adding from a low point to come back? For instance, you see 260.4 superintendents, but we have 286 districts. So similar to the situation we were discussing earlier, not to bring that back up again, some districts do share superintendents.
Other questions? Senator Gossage.
Thank you so much for being here. You know, when we were talking about special ed and how special ed is funded, and one of the questions we had was, we're given FTE, but we were wondering if that could be broken out into paras, and we realized it's a percentage of FTE for a para. Can we see that anywhere in this document?
Paras would be on the next document.
I see the special education paraprofessionals, and how does that compare to special education teachers? Am I missing that somewhere?
A special education teacher is a licensed teacher, and they're hired to teach. Paraprofessionals would be on the non-licensed personnel printout, and they are not a licensed teacher, so they're not allowed to carry those responsibilities that a teacher would.
Right. I was just thinking of the FTE, if I could extrapolate from these documents. What we had asked for before was, we were given the FTE for how special education was paid, but we were trying to find out that FTE doesn't really help us.
Yeah, how many were teachers, how many were paras?
Correct.
We'll have that number for you.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes. Any other questions? Senator Petty.
So Craig, when I asked that question earlier about 4-year-old at risk, and so this table is somewhat of a reflection of their, we've gone from 670 pre-kindergarten teachers, because there are very few districts that don't have that. Well, you could tell me, I shouldn't even say that, but the majority of preschool programs are 4-year-old at-risk programs.
Yes, although in the last 2 years, the statute has allowed addition of 3-year-old at-risk students as soon as funding was available. In the last 2 years, funding has been available. So those programs now can include 3-year-olds. And so that's part of the reason for the growth in teachers you see. The other part is what you're alluding to. More and more districts are adding those programs.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just an observation on kindergarten. So we lost 133 teachers. Is it because our kindergarten population, do you believe, has declined?
For the years we're talking about, and everybody's tired of hearing about this, but we're taking in the COVID years, and in particular, younger children were more likely to be kept at home by parents during that time. Or that's what the data would appear to show. I shouldn't say that was their reason.
And in some districts, all kids were at home.
Right. So, and may I,
So yes, the enrollment is
Could be a
a
factor.
large part of the reason, but that could be part of the reason that enrollment
do you
declined.
think, I know we're making generalizations because we don't have the details by district, but do you think the addition of the social work services is part of that mental health focus,
Yes, I do.
using those funds to add?
Based on what school districts talk about, yes.
And I know we're just guessing, it's just observations. Thank you, thank you.
talk to us a bit about the vocational, the VE teachers. So we're showing that at present, we're at 1,754.5. But for those teachers, we have a lot of VE-funded programs where the teacher might teach 2 or 3 courses that are VE funded and the rest of them are considered more gen ed courses. So would that be like a 0.3 for the 3 courses that they taught that are VE funded and then 0.7 on the gen ed courses? So is that how that appears?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. That's what I thought. Senator Petty and then Senator Erickson.
And Craig, who would fall in other teachers? I've seen all these categories.
Okay, I have to look at the list always to see what's not being covered. Other teachers is second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, science, math, English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's kind of misleading. You don't normally think of that group as
big
other
pool.
teachers. Yes.
Okay. Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig, I'm looking at the licensed personnel, and I noticed that there's been a decrease of 26.3 reading specialists and teachers. Can you tell me what that's attributable to?
Honestly, no, I don't know what the reason for that is. I could only hazard guesses and they wouldn't be very accurate. I'll see if somebody else in our department probably knows. We'll see if we can get that answered.
Thank you.
Any other questions on licensed personnel, FTE by position? Seeing none, let's move on to the next.
So you have a similar printout for non-licensed personnel. It starts with SF 23-039. And same concept. How much did it change from 1920 to 22-23? And again, I always feel like I have to point out, non-licensed means KSDE does not license them. So when you see nurses, certainly nurses have a license, but they're not licensed by KSDE, so on our system, they're considered non-licensed.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I notice, Craig, that there's a huge jump in Rule 10 coaches. And it's been my experience as a building administrator that unless you're very careful, Rule 10 coaches can cost quite a bit more than a non-Rule 10 coach, because if you're a licensed teacher and you take a supplemental for coaching, per hour it's pennies. But if you're Rule 10, you get paid an hourly wage, and that can be exponentially more than what a licensed teacher is paid. So I'm just curious, again, do you have any idea why there's such an increase in Rule 10 coaches?
Actually, that one I do. A better clarification from us of how you define and report a Rule 10 coach. They were being reported incorrectly in the past. So I don't believe the number jumped that much, just the reporting got more accurate.
Senator Dietrich.
It's been a while, but I think our Rule 10 coaches signed a contract for the position in the season. Is that what you're considering a Rule 10? They don't teach in the building?
Correct.
And they're not licensed.
Good
Not
point. Thank you.
licensed,
For
and
the
they-
rest of the
okay.
committee, Rule 10 coaches is somebody you hire from the community that's not licensed as an educator, and they're going to come in and help you coach a particular activity or sport. And I'll just leave it there.
Okay. I just want
Any other questions? Seeing none, I think we can move on.
SF 23041, there was a question asked back on the kindergarten and pre-K programming, what those head counts look like. I believe we gave you FTE on a printout, and so the question was about head counts. So kindergarten and below, there are 3 separate programs that we count. If a school district just runs a preschool for any and all children, those students are not necessarily funded, so we don't keep head counts on them. The ones that are funded are what we talked about earlier, the pre-K at risk. So column 1, when you get down to the printout, is what's the head count of the pre-K at risk students. Column 2, pre-K students who have an IEP, and that's 3 and 4-year-olds. with an IEP, services are provided, and kindergarten headcount. And you should see 4 years' worth of data on each of those.
Committee, any questions? I'm not seeing any.
Okay, so next we have SF 23-042, and that's regular FTE and virtual FTE. They are funded separately. And I'm getting a strange message. There we go. For whatever reason, I can't scroll down and see what's on this printout. So, what I believe what you should see is a column with the regular FTE enrollment in a district and a column with the virtual FTE enrollment separated. Since they are funded separately, we count them separately. And then I don't remember, I can't see it. Is there a third column that totals the two? Okay, good.
We've got that all. Any questions? Not seeing any.
Okay, and I believe the final one is SF 23-044, dropout and graduation rates. And again, I'm locked up, so I can't see it, but which will be a real challenge. I'm not an expert on cohort groups, but the primary point to be made is the dropout rate dropout rate will not add together with the graduation rate and give you 100%. They're not opposites of each other. Oh, thanks, JG. So dropout rate is calculated every year. How many students dropped out this year? What's the percentage of dropouts? Graduation rate is based on a cohort group. So when you calculate that for a freshman, you're looking at all the students that going back to 9th grade started with that group. And then there are allowances made, and this is a federal definition, for students that move in, students that move out if they go to another school and enroll. If they move out and don't enroll anywhere, that's a dropout. So you can't add, like I say, you can't add dropout rate and graduation rate and get 100%. They're not correlated that way. Clarification of a couple of the symbols that you'll see, a graduation rate of 0 means they have a cohort group, but nobody graduated that year. There may be a variety of reasons, including the district reported it wrong in 1 or 2 cases. If you see NA, we do have a few districts, public and private, that don't have a high school. They're K through 9 districts, for instance, or K through 8. So NA, it's not applicable for a graduation rate.
Do we have questions about graduation and dropout rates? I guess it's dropout percentage and graduation rates.
Tiny numbers. One advantage on your computer, if you can find it, you can zoom in on those. If we gave you a paper copy, we'd all be looking for stronger glasses, probably.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. So when you're figuring out the state graduation rate, do you take the total number of students divided by the total number, or the total number of graduates divided, or do you take the percentage that each district gives you and average the percentage, the graduation percentage together?
You can't take an average of percentages, because then Wichita counts the same as St. Francis.
Okay.
So it has to be weighted, which essentially means you count the students and you count the graduates.
Perfect, thank you.
And when we look at this graduation rate, I will ask the question specifically for Spring Hill and Johnson County. Is that including the virtual students?
It does.
I thought those were supposed to be broken out separate.
Well, maybe I should look at Spring Hill's number.
It says it is 83.7. And prior ones show like 61%, 67%, 78%.
Yes, that includes all of their students, which includes the virtual programs. So this is a graduation rate for a district, not for a building or a school. So it does include the virtual
I
students.
think we were supposed to get separate. I thought that was supposed to be measured out separately.
They are, after last session, it's now calculated differently for the virtual students, but we have to be able to report it for the entire district.
I think the intent was that we would get a report for those that are face-to-face, and we would get a report that would be for the virtual school districts.
I think we can do that.
Okay. And the reason that's significant is we know just how much of transferring children out of a face-to-face district and saying, you're going to fail here, here are some virtual options. And we know that those virtual programs throughout our state are receiving students that are severely credit deficit when they move into virtual. Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig, do those numbers include students that may have, well, I know in more recent that we have more students getting dual credit for college courses. Is there any chance that any of these students have left high school without a high school diploma, but have continued their education post-secondary?
That's a possibility, yes, because I shouldn't say this is true now. It used to be true. In some community colleges, if you had a GED, you were allowed to enroll. So yes, they may have not finished high school, thought better of it, completed a GED, and now they're continuing in post-secondary.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I know that to be the case because I have a student myself who was part of a virtual program, did not graduate through their program, but instead graduated through private homeschool because we had privately homeschooled part of that time. Sure. Attended the community college during those high school years, virtually, during COVID even, and is now still in post-secondary education. So I think that the data here doesn't tell the whole story. You know, I think there's, related to the information we received yesterday, I think there are a lot of things we could deduct from, from that information that might help us understand some of this a little bit better also.
Certainly true.
Any additional questions? Seeing none. I believe that's all, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. Committee, I was a little bit hopeful that we could start some work on Senate Bill 13, but we are essentially out of time. But I do have a quick question for our revisor and for research. Were we able to learn anything from Keisha with regard to increasing of fees? We've not seen anything yet. Okay. So I have seen one request for amendment to the bill and we're talking about Senate Bill 13. I have seen one set of amendments that had been requested that allows for if a within-state organization has provided X number % of coverage during the season, they should be able to go in and do some filming. So or live streaming. So I've seen that. But if you have any other amendments and you have not worked with Tamara, please make sure that we get that done. Okay? Committee, seeing no further business, we will see you at this time. Actually an hour early. We will see you at 1:30 tomorrow. We're adjourned.